And Bill, you might comment about how important CES shows for people like Jack, right?
Well, they gave us. We actually got to start in August, so they definitely waited to the last minute to drop it on you.
Well, it was because we're moving across country, right? I mean, okay.
There you
so.
Yeah, we used to say, "Is there life after CES?" And for weeks afterwards, everybody would be walking the halls in a stupor. They didn't know how to live or go take showers after a CES show.
Well, more importantly, it was just crucial to Jack, right? And Jack never gave you enough time to do a project, right?
And it was a date that you couldn't move, no matter what excuse you made.
Right.
The CES show.
You got fired if you didn't make the show. That was his game plan, and I saw him do it to people, right? Okay, so Andre says, okay, I'm going to give you all the help you want. Well, I said, well, let me tell you something. We brought up the Apple One in the Apple garage, right? And Peter stayed in contact with these guys, and they're working on a new generation, which they call the Apple II. Why don't we buy them, right? And that'll give us a jump start, right? Because they're further along than we are. And so we brought Steve over to the Commodore building, and with Andre acting as the bridge here. And Andre takes him to Jack and says, Jack, you really ought to buy this company. It's a way to make the show. And Jack asked Steve how many he was selling. I think it was like maybe 100 a month or 50 a month, some small number, right, of the Apple IIs, Apple Ones, and not making any money on them. Right? Nobody was making any real serious money on kid computers. And Jack says, well, I'll tell you what, I want you to help Chuck do this new machine, so I'll give you $50,000 for your company, and you can come over and go to work for us, and if it works, I'll pay you a royalty. Well, right about the same time, Mike Markkula got excited about it and told Jobs, I'll put real money in and help you run the company. And so Jobs told Jack to go away. Now, from that whole discussion, there's a whole legend out there about Bill Gates and I trying to buy Apple. Bill Gates wasn't part of that, right? It was literally Andre Suzanne and Jack Tramiel. And one of the important things that went on during this time, which I'm going to tie in a minute, is Steve and I are literally talking because Jack wants to meet with Steve Jobs by himself. And by the way, Steve didn't ever let Woz into business discussions anyhow, because Woz was truly a nerd. And so I'm sitting there and we're having a debate about what the characteristics of the next machine is. And Woz said, I've developed this new programming language called Sweet 16. And Bill, did you ever use it?
No.
You might ask Jerry if there's anybody on the website that ever used Sweet 16. It was actually on the original Apple II. And it was a great version of the 6502 code, right? It was a really, really well done capability of writing 6502 code, right? It was sweet. It literally was Sweet 16, and always does good things. Always did good things like that. Okay, didn't know how to design. That's why the Apple II had a bunch of errors in it. But he had good ideas like that. And I said, but why?
People are starting to chime in, saying yes.
They did use it. Good. Okay. Ask them if they thought it was really good way to write 6502.
Oh, they hear you, so.
Yeah. Well, the question is, did they think it's the right way to do 6502 code? It was really a nice thing, right? It never went anywhere because we didn't support it, and Apple quit supporting it. Anyhow, and I told Woz my story about we're doing a basic machine, right, with a good screen editor and character graphics, and Woz was appalled. He said, no, the hobbyists told me what they want, and I want this other thing, right? And by the way, they were telling him that he was going to the hobby club up at Stanford, and he was doing a machine for himself and for hobbyists, and I was doing a machine for this nebulous programmer who wanted a basic machine. Okay, so anyhow, so that reason I'm doing that is that this is at the time they're designing the Apple II that Woz believes this, and Jobs is not a designer. The guy who was designing the Apple II was Woz, and he didn't even have any idea why he needed BASIC. Okay, so it wasn't designed around BASIC; it was designed around Sweet 16. Okay, I got a call while I'm at Most Technology from a guy by the name of Rick Weiland at Microsoft, and he says, you got the 6502, I got a BASIC for it, and my boss tells me I've got to get it paid for it because I wrote it, and he doesn't believe in the 6502. He wants to dump it. Okay? And Bill didn't believe in 6502 because he said you can't have a serious computer. It's only got an 8-bit stack. Okay? And he's right. But it was funny because Bill Gates made a lot of money off being wrong. But anyhow, the point was that, so I'm driving across country with one car in the truck, another car being towed behind me, my wife following me with the kids in another car, and we go through Albuquerque deliberately so I can sit down with Gates. At that point, Microsoft is in 2 rooms over a bank, and I go up and see Weiland, and I said, look, BASIC isn't good enough. I've been using BASIC now for this period of time. BASIC isn't good enough to be a system for real people, right? It's got to have more structure and more things, right? And I told him what my basic idea was, and he went in to see Gates, and Gates said, well, if you've got extensions to BASIC and you're going to pay me for all of this, I'll send Rick out, and you guys can tell us what you want new, and we'll add it. Okay? Okay. So then I'd finish driving across country. We get started. Weiland comes out, and we put into the BASIC the character graphics that you have on the back side of BASIC, of the ASCII chipset, ASCII chipset character set. Anybody doesn't believe me, go look at the ASCII character set. You'll find our hearts, diamonds, clubs, and all the corners, right? We put in the I/O structure that allowed us to do I/O. The guy at Dartmouth only let I/O happen with data statements. Well, just like with the PIA, BASIC didn't have a communication that let it do things. Okay? So we put the instruction set in, and of course we put peek and poke in, which drove everybody crazy. But it was something you could do, right? But we put the if you look at the difference between Dartmouth BASIC, and you look at what we sold, right, you'll see the differences. And they were very important differences, and both Peter and I understood it, and when we explained it to Rick, he understood it. And so we didn't have any problem. They put it in. We signed a contract with Bill, paid him a one-time fee, and we were going away and doing our machine. The thing that made the PET possible at that point was a couple of things. We had the cheap processor. We were making it ourselves. We had a little bit of memory available, but the ROM had suddenly taken off because of the calculator business. People had learned how to make ROMs cheaply, and so there was a big enough ROM to put the BASIC in ROM. Now, to you guys today, that sounds funny, right? But you got to remember, up until then, if you got a suiting machine or something or other, you put BASIC on a cassette and you loaded it and then wrote some code in the crummy little memory space they gave you, right? Putting the BASIC and the operating system and the screen generator and all that stuff in ROM, we're the first people that did that, right? Because we put a real BASIC in, because we put a real human way of communicating, and those of you who grew up with any of the Commodore products know what I mean about a screen editor, okay? Bill, you guys carried the screen editor concept into doing graphics too, right?
Yeah, in structures. Terry Ryan and Fred Bowen added structures and all the sprite controls and all those things.
Yeah, and it was, again, easy to do, right?
Yes.
You could use a screen editor, and you could make it and look at it and then come back and change it. And
who did the screen editor? Was that John Fagans or was that Microsoft?
You're looking
screen
at
editor function.
You're looking at him.
Oh, okay. See, my urban legend's all messed up.
No, I absolutely wrote the screen editor because I knew what I wanted for a screen editor, and I didn't trust any programmer to do it, with all due respect.
So it wasn't Microsoft. That's where I was at.
Oh, definitely. Shit. Microsoft never... You saw MS-DOS. They didn't know how to use computers.
It was rumored that the one thing we kept on our version was that entry screen that said copyright Microsoft, and the rest was some rewrite.
Yeah. No. The screen, the Microsoft stuff was just to protect their BASIC, right? But and Gates was paranoid about it because everybody was ripping him off on the BASIC. And no, the screen editor was my idea, my plan, my coding, and I made it so people could use it, right?
Thank you so much. When I was a kid, I couldn't understand some of these other computers that you couldn't
that's the
move
point.
around.
No, that was the point. You got to understand, you were my target audience. You were probably 12, right? When you started, right? You were my target audience, right? I wanted 12-year-olds and finance people who got hooked on BASIC to be able to do this, and they don't understand C/bullshit. Okay? Right? Seriously, right? We set the computer industry back 5 years when we did MS-DOS. Okay,
you heard it here first, folks.
Listen, it was financially attractive. Okay, to both of us, all of us, right? But I felt really bad about it, to the point I really can't use MS-DOS today because I hated it. I said I'm gonna. Somebody said, "Well, how can you sell all these machines using MS-DOS?" And I said, "Drug dealers don't use drugs, right? I mean, come on." But because in 6502 I did program, and I did program in the past. No, Screen Editor was mine. The cassette was mine. Fagan's, and we're going to get into Fagan's in a minute. Okay, so now we're sitting on the West Coast with a BASIC, right? But, every computer needs an operating system. And I don't have any programmers, and Trammell didn't have any programmers, right? So I luckily had taught at University of, at Motorola, a guy who was the chief computer trainer at in Ames, Iowa, okay? And we stayed in touch, and he taught the 6502 and went around the country with a guy who at that time was called Jeri and Bil, who probably most of you know her as shit. I'll get her name. Anyhow, but Roger and I stayed tight. So I called Roger up and said, I need a really bright programmer who has no bias, right? And you got to have given him to with no bias. And he said, well, I got this weird kid who's here, right? Who's going to go to work for IBM, and they're just going to put him off in a corner, and he's never going to be anything, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to force this kid. Roger was that kind of instructor that everybody listened to him, because he was like a god, right? I want to force this kid to come out and talk to you, all right? And he used the word force. And so this guy, I meet him at the airport, took him out, put him in a hotel, and I wouldn't give him his return ticket home, okay? Remember the word force? And I spent about 2 days, I had hired Siler, Siler was there, I spent about 2 days telling him why it was going to be important for him to do the personal computer with us, okay? And I think it's because we bullied him, right? But he ultimately accepted. John Fagans was a great programmer, and he was very focused, and he did the operating system, and we still use that operating system all the way through the 664, right? I mean, he just kept it going, right? I mean, he was just a great programmer, and he was right out of school, and he met my criteria. He didn't know what he couldn't do, right? And I had Siler who didn't know what he could do either, right? And I had another guy by the name of Webster who came from Commodore, and he didn't know what he couldn't do either. So he read Adam Osmond's write-up on how a screen ought to work, right? And we hacked together a screen. And Bill, you probably guess what happened the first time we hooked the screen up.
You popped the fuse?
No, it was upside down.
Upside down. At least it wasn't right to left or something.
No, but it was upside down, right? Because we didn't get it, right? You had to do this to make it right side up, right? I mean, seriously, I'm showing this, getting an hour away from showing it to this guy at Radio Shack at the CES show, and the goddamn screen's upside down. Right? I can't remember. We hacked it.
Now, the hardware answer to that is you rewire the yoke on the CRT real quick, but
I can't remember what it was, but somehow or other we got it done, right? I mean, but my point was, we didn't know crap, right? And all we knew was this vision about what we wanted to do, and it was my vision and Suzanne's vision, right? And Siler helped us then, and Fagans jumped in, and so I've given John the credit he's due, right? because he did all the operating systems for Commodore all the way through from that point. Almost all single-handed, by the way, right? Seiler came out and drove the hardware, right? Helped make it go together. This guy Don Webster was working on that screen, and the guys who helped me put the case together and the keyboards and everything else was Fujiyama-san, who was one of Jack's more senior guys. To give you a feel for Fujiyama-san's background, he and his mother and father were trapped when the Japanese were overrun, and they were trapped on the Chinese-Korean border. And his father put his mother and him on a train and got killed, right? And his mother had to get them through all of Korea and down into Japan. And it was so he did not start with an easy life, okay? And he was Jack's guy who knew about keyboards, who could sit down and talk to people, and he's the guy that found the people that made the original, and he actually talked the guys into, the people in I think it was Sanyo, into building me a flyback and a yoke, right? Because they didn't know how to do flyback and yokes for anything other than TVs, right? And why do you want a flyback and yoke? And so we got the screen from one guy, and we got the flyback and yoke, and I think if I hadn't had Fujiyama-san, because they respected him, they didn't respect me, right? But they you know, I mean, you guys nowadays don't have any feel for the fact, because everybody's got video capability and everything else, but we were taking somebody's screen, somebody's flyback, and putting them together on a board, not knowing what the hell we're doing, right? And they were very helpful. Fujiyama got all of that done. We did that. And Fujiyama's the one that got me hooked in with the guys that made the cassette recorder, right? So, and he was the guy that, along with Jack, came up with the Chiclet keyboard. So that work was all done by this two guys from Japan. He had a technician by the name of Aoji, who I think wasn't the guy you talked to. But he, they were, and Webster, that was it. Peter Sandel, right? As long until Jack fired him. Now, when we didn't do Apple, Peter actually found another 6502 customer who had a board that we could use. And, you know, so the original PET, I don't know, did you ever see the wooden PET? Was it still like Commodore? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. If you open that up, you discover that it was jam-packed of electronics that didn't look anything like the final one, right? We just hacked our way through, because it was a 6502, and we could find a way to hook the ROM in here and hook the video upside down and all that stuff. Yeah. We actually built it around somebody's, I think it was a controller for machine tools, right? We actually used. And we got the case made by a local model maker, right? And we're getting ready to put this thing to the show, and we kind of got it working, right? And we went to the show and stayed up all night for 2 nights at the show and got it to the point we could demo it. And we demoed it to Radio Shack, and then John Roach, who we demoed it to, became the head of Radio Shack. And Jack sat down, and there was a guy by the name of Sam. You wouldn't have known Sam, he was gone then. Sam Bernstein. Sam was the sales guy for Commodore. Suzanne was the engineering manager till he got fired. Peter was involved till he got fired. Sam was up and down but never got fired. And Sam had actually hooked us into Radio Shack. And Radio Shack's definition was similar to mine. They wanted a self-contained unit that they could sell in the stores, right? So that they also agreed that we should build in a monitor. And you got to remember, nobody done that until then, right? And so when we showed it to Radio Shack, Jack expected that we would get the order from Radio Shack, and he wouldn't have to do it himself. He'd just use Radio Shack's money. And he tried to sell John Roach calculators as part of the deal. and John Roach had advanced warned about what was coming out of Japan, for the CMOS. And he, of course, didn't tell Jack, but he said, no way, I'm going to tie in calculators to this. Bye. Thanks, Jack. Bye. Right? And
I was going to say, didn't that negotiation break down by like noon that day or something?
Yeah. It didn't last long. Yeah. We just so we came back from the show, and Jack said, listen, you worked real hard, and I know we didn't quite get it the way we wanted it, so I'm going to let you keep working, see if you can turn it into something. But he wasn't very enthusiastic about it. But I had this team of guys who were working on it together, and we took the model to the first, I think it was called the West Coast Computer Fair, done by, I feel bad if I've forgotten his name. This guy dreamed up the idea. I'll get his name. I promise I'll get his name. Jim Warren. Jim Warren was sitting around. He was we had a whole bunch of guys who were maybe a little bit like your team, Jared, guys that were just in and out of technology, doing all different kinds of stuff. They were into Park. They were into all this stuff. And Jim felt that in order to move the industry along and also to make some money for him, that he would have the thing he called the West Coast Computer Fair. And he just sent out flyers to anybody that made boards or anything, and you had to go pay for space on the floor. And then we were in the Cow Palace, and if you wanted to go to the show, there were no free passes. $25. Okay. Well, Jack Trammell comes down to the show and discovers there's a big long line in the street of guys wanting to pay $25 to just go look at what people were making. And he said, that's my industry. You're going to get the backing. I'm serious, right? Yeah. Absolutely convinced him that it was a business, right? And at that show, Apple kind of had a hack. We were done, and there's this piece I'm going to fax you guys was actually done as a result of the show. You'll see all the quotes and everything. It was done as a result of the show. And John Roach came by with his team and showed them what we're doing, and by the time I had BASIC running and everything else, and so they went back and designed the TRS-80, and they decided that they couldn't find a ROM big enough, so they bought Tiny BASIC from some guy in Berkeley, and Apple was still on the Sweet 16 route, so we were starting to get products. Remember, Apple didn't have a built-in screen, but they hooked up to screens. Radio Shack and I were going to do screens. Radio Shack actually didn't announce till September that year on the East Coast Computer Fair. So Jim Warren was an important part of our lives, right? Because he really kind of put stake in the ground that said, this is a real business for which people are willing to pay real money, right? So Jack then backed us doing it, right? And Bill, do you think it's this time to talk about the chiclet story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm a computer nerd, right? I've been using computers forever. I worked on teletypes. I worked on, keyboards. My first personal computer was a GE 400 with hard disk drives that took up a room. So I knew that in order to talk to a computer, you had to have a typewriter keyboard, and I typed to get through college. And so I'm putting a typewriter keyboard in this case, and I'm having a little bit of trouble because we're trying to fit the keyboard and everything else. And Jack comes by, and he says, why are you putting a keyboard on there? And I said, but Jack, all computers have to have a touch-type keyboard. Jack says, let me tell you a story. He said, I started Commodore
teletype or
in the mechanical calculator business. I used to make mechanical calculators, and you had to have a 10-key pad to drive a mechanical calculator, right? Everybody that was using calculators had a 10-key pad, right? Period. And he said these idiots at HP introduced this product out of Japan with about 100 different keys, none of which are 10-key, right? And they kicked my ass, right? And he said, tell me how you know that people that are going to buy a personal computer don't want a better keyboard, right? And guess what? When you're doing a product like this, you better shut up and listen. Not because he's the boss, but because he might be right, right? I mean, who knows? He's right. It's a new product, new market. You in the toy business, Jerry, you know what I'm talking about, right? You don't have a clue unless you try things, right?
Exactly. Right? It's not until after it's all said and done that you can decide whether it was right.
Yeah. So we did it. And by the way, Jack was also trying to save money because he could buy that keyboard for almost nothing. Okay.
Designed from stock. Yeah, we know that move.
Well, we both know that Tramel's underlying agenda was always cash and always cost, right? So you got used to that. But I couldn't tell him he was wrong. I really couldn't tell him he's wrong. I could tell him I was wrong after 3 months, right? Because the marketplace clearly told us. And your famous C64 was what? It was a keyboard with the computer inside, right? Right? A real typing keyboard with a computer inside. And all the CBM machines and everything after that, became standard typewriter keyboards because the market clearly said, we love your little product, but, we want it to be able to type normally. But at the beginning, it was kind of fun because you could do the character graphics directly on the keyboard. Jared, do you ever see one? Do you ever use a chiclet?
The 2001? Yes.
You used the chiclet, right?
Yes.
So you wrote the code. It was much easier to do character graphics with the fancy keyboard, right? It was funny because my kid, who was just growing up during this time, had his pet at home and everything else, and he saw the new one, and he said, "What are you doing? Why are you changing keyboards? I like this keyboard." Right? And of course, nowadays, every kid in the world types on crummy little pieces of everything, right? And does, we didn't quite get there then, but now Jack was right, right? I mean, every kid in the world now texts on little itty bitty pieces of, nobody's got a 10-key keyboard anymore except me. I mean, a typewriter keyboard except me, right? And but anyhow, but that was what happened, right? So that was the only mistake we made. And if you think about it, it wasn't such a terrible mistake, right? It product differentiated us a little bit at the beginning. And the people that were buying it at the beginning didn't care. They were so happy to have something that worked, right? And clearly we had to change, and did, right? Okay, so we got the chiclet keyboard out of the way. We got the case. Now I got to tell you about why the beautiful wooden case that Bill saw didn't make it to the market. All right. The Commodore machines that you guys all had were square metal boxes, right, with a screen in it built in. We got down to getting serious about this, and I told Jack I got to go get $100,000 to tool the case. And he says, I don't have $100,000. We're broke. But I got a solution. I have some guys in Toronto that make file cabinets. So he brought the file cabinet guys down, and he said, here's the wooden box, and you go back and make a nice looking metal box that matches this wooden box, and here's how you can spend on it, right? And these guys went back and did it, and Jack says, okay, Chuck, you're going to go to market with this. Well, when the guy says he doesn't have any other money, you're going to argue with him, right? I mean, we're going to go to market with a metal case.
Was it really that bad of a change? I kind of like the look of the old metal pet.
I think it's because we sold it to you.
You bought it.
What? No, seriously. It was the other looked like a video terminal, right? Right, and that's what we were trying to do. We're trying to make people believe they were getting a video terminal, just like the IEEE interface, right? All of those things were done to make what people were going to call a toy computer, right? Because it was being sold for $500. I wanted to keep getting rid of the definition of toy computer, right? And so I put the IEEE bus on, because it made it not a toy. By the way, I kicked the shit out of HP and Tektronix, who were selling basic machines for 10 times the price, right? Each of them come down to me and said, we don't think you can do it for that. I've had people tell me that at Victor, MOS Technology, everywhere. I always tell me that what I'm doing you can't do for that price, and I tell people now, I'm glad you said that because it means I know I'm going to succeed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we did then, right, is we're getting ready to take this product out, and we know we don't have any money and everything. And so I got to tell the one last story, and then I'll try to move on and jump a couple generations. Leonard Trammell, John Fagans, Bill Seiler, and these other two guys and I were the only team working on it because Susanna got fired. And so there was a show called a Joint Computer Show in Dallas, and they announced that they were going to take a basement and turn it over to this new thing called personal computers, or I can't remember, it was something else, right? Retail computers, I think is what they called it. Okay, so we decided we had the product demonstratable at that point, really truly demonstratable, not just something we could play with the keyboard, and we could build 2 or 3 of them. So we said, okay, that's the place to launch it, right? And so I told Jack, and we go to the show, and this is what I'm going to spend and everything. And he said, oh, now I'm going to explain to you something, right? Because he and I always talked about, I want to make a machine like Hewlett-Packard. And I always thought he meant he wanted a high-quality machine. But what Jack had noticed, and he based our whole company around, was the fact that when HP first came out with their calculator, you ordered the calculator from HP and you sent your money in, and that got you in a queue, and then 90 days later they shipped you the calculator. Now HP didn't need the cash flow, but we did. So my orders were go to Dallas, sign up as many guys as you can, get their checks, we're going to cash them, then we can go into production. And that's what we did. We went down to the show. My wife came along, same wife that was selling Steve Jobs' his stuff out of the... And her job was to take the checks and put down people's names. And we would give a demo, and then we would step back, and there would be this big crowd of people there. And people were handing checks in the back and saying, you have to take mine first, I showed it to you. I mean, we looked at people fighting over their place in queue, okay? Because we weren't shipping, 90 days, we'll give you your money back, we're going to ship, right? And so come out of the computer business, right? I've been to all these joint computer shows. So I took a break, well, because the crowd was big and it was obvious going to take her a while to get the checks. And I walked upstairs, and this room we were in is jam-packed of people buying from us and looking at everything else. The entire top floor full of beautiful, wonderful, expensive 360s and online system was totally empty. Right? The only people who were there were the salesmen who couldn't break away to go downstairs. That was the last of those shows, and that was the end of the computer. Right? Oh. No, we still kept doing it, and we kept going, but fundamentally, that sounds funny because we weren't shipping the product in high volume and everything else, but that was it. It was obvious that everybody had moved on, and the market had moved on. We just weren't caught up with the market yet. We started shipping the computers, right? We got all kinds of funny stories. I made Seiler and all those guys who went to all these first shows, and you can't believe the adoration that these guys got at these early shows, right? I mean, because they're selling a product people really wanted, right? Like, Jesus Christ, and at a price I can afford. I mean, people were just totally in love with them. And I said, okay, you're going to go back in a year, and you're going to have to see those same people, and every mistake we made, they're going to come in and tell us about, right? And I've always followed that philosophy. I always make my engineers go to the first show and the second show, right? And as you know, Bill, there's usually a few people in the audience that are disgruntled about something you did wrong, right? And it's a great lesson. I kept that engineering team with me for 3 different companies, and it really worked, right? They always remembered that first time.
Yeah. I remember my first CES show, and that's I had done the TED, and boy, did I get an earful of that. What became the Plus 4, and that's where the 128 came from. It goes all the way back to those comments I got that day.
Yeah, because it's really useful, right? It really is.
Yeah.
We did a CES in January where we did a big screen like you have today. We had a bunch of Commodores up on the screens, and we did demos, and we started signing up dealers, right, for the first time. Before, we'd just been taking people's checks, and dealers were coming up and paying us for 100 machines or 500 machines, right, in order to stay in queue, and it really bootstrapped the company. We had some production issues early on. We solved them, and it became a business, right? Okay, about that time, so now I want to go back and establish our place in history, all right? This was the fall of 76, beginning of 77, okay? By the West Coast Computer Fair was like March 77. We were shipping. We went to the show in the summer of 77. We started shipping volume in 78. After the CES show in Vegas, Mike Markula said, "We're getting killed because we don't have a BASIC." So he made his manager, his president, or Jobs, which one of them, go down and negotiate with Gates to buy the BASIC, for which they paid about 5 times what I paid, one-time fee, and put the BASIC in the Apple, because he could see that he wasn't going to get anywhere until he did. And John Roach, 3 months later, walked into Bill Gates' office and said, "Hey, I got to have your BASIC on my machine because I'm getting my butt kicked," right? And and he said, "But I figured out a way. I don't want to pay you a big upfront fee," because by that time Bill figured, Commodore to Apple 5 times, Radio Shack 10 times more fee, right? I don't want to pay you a big upfront fee. I want to pay you a royalty. And Bill says, "I don't believe in you guys." Literally said this to Roach. "I don't believe in you guys. I'm not going to take a royalty. I want my money." Okay, so he took a fee and went off and he was keeping his company going, but didn't have the idea of royalties, right? The guy who taught him about royalties is a kid that came out of Japan, a guy by the name of Kei Nishi, that wrote a magazine called ASCII in Japan, a really young guy. Came over to the show, got introduced to Bill Gates, and effectively moved into Microsoft. And he convinced Bill Gates that they should go do a machine together with the Japanese called the MSX. Okay? And the MSX was going to be a basic built machine, low cost, coming out of Japan, that was going to make Japan the leading computer supplier in the same way they had done with watches and calculators. Right?
Yes.
Okay? They had a problem. Okay? But, oh, by the way, the Japanese paid up front, and we're going to pay a royalty, because Kay said, "You're crazy." He convinced Bill, "You're crazy. You need to get a royalty on all this stuff because it's going to sell." And by that time, it was selling in some volume. Okay. The problem is that we had done the C60, we'd done the PET, we did the CBM, which did very well in Europe. Right? I don't think it did as well here in the United States, but it did very well in Europe because everybody was using it as a business computer. At that point, it was obvious that I needed a printer, right? And the only printer that was available at that time was the Centronics, which was going for like $1,000 minimum, right, for a printer. And so I went to the head of Centronics, met with him in New York. I remember this meeting, which was really prophetic. And I said to the guy, "Look, we're going to sell millions of these computers, right? But we're going to sell millions of them at $100 to $500. People aren't going to pay $1,000 for a crummy-ass printer to go on this machine. Why don't you sit down with me and we'll design a reduced version of your computer or of your printer that will sell into this market?" And I remember the guy's words. "All you're going to do is screw up my business by selling your cheap machines." Okay? And I said to him in that meeting, I said, "What you just did, I gave you your last chance. I'm going to go away. I'm going to do a cheap printer for my computer, and you're going to be out of business. And guess what? I went down, the guys from Seiko said that they would take one of their calculator printers, right, and put it in the format. And I think you saw those original dot matrix printers we did.
Yep.
From Seiko, right? And I designed the electronics. This guy who did the watch for Seiko, right? The guy who did the watch ran the factory, and he did the design. That we put the case together and everything else, and we designed it. I was actually designing it during the Hanover Fair and finished it, and we brought that product out with Seiko selling them to us, and we were the only guys selling a low-cost dot matrix printer, and we kicked everybody's butt. And of course, that company then turned into Epson.
Right.
Okay. And guess what? Epson's still in the business. And that guy was running Centronics. The only thing, any memory you have of him is the Centronics interface, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, he just went away. And the floppy disk was the other thing we had to have, right? And I knew about disk systems. I knew we had to have floppy disk. But my problem is I knew I needed 2 floppy disks, right? Because I wasn't thinking about program loading so much as I was thinking about doing something real. And if you're going to do anything real, you've got to have one to read from and one to write to, right?
Right. Data.
What?
I said a data drive, yeah.
I mean, if you're going to do real things, right? So I went back to my buddy at Iowa State and hired 2 bright young guys out of Iowa State. Then I went to work for Apple for a while. When I came back, these guys had butchered the thing up, so it didn't work, right? and heard everybody whining about the fact that the Apple cassette didn't work. So in about 3 weeks, he reinvented GCR and built the original Apple floppy. Okay, so Trammell kicked my butt up and down the stairs. He said, "You're out of the computer business. You've been talking about floppy disks forever, and you couldn't deliver a floppy before Apple." And he was right, because we were focusing on the double, and these kids didn't understand it. So we had to go back and redesign it, but we ultimately did. We had a much higher capacity than Apple, and we did a dual only, right? And I guess finally we did a single, but fundamentally for for the CBM, the dual was what sold. But now we knew we had a floppy, right? And now all of a sudden, the reason we had a floppy is because we were right next door to Shugart Associates.
Right.
And a guy by the name of Finest Connor, who was one of the partners that started Shugart Associates with Shugart, came up with the idea that they were making a product that only about half of them were high enough quality for the word processing guys. So he said, well, why don't I jump the rest of this junk off to these computer guys, right? And I had a guy by the name of Tom Mitchell that worked with Finest somewhere or other, and so we signed up and got a very high allocation, and then Jobs came in, he got an allocation. Radio Shack went to these guys and said, I want an allocation. They said, we're already allocated out, right? So he went to a guy making heads in Southern California by the name of Juggy Tandon. And he said to Juggy, who actually invented the first floppy disk at IBM, he did the first magnetic Meteon, but he and Al didn't get along, so he didn't go to Shugart. But he invented the double-sided head. He was making heads, and John Roach said, I need somebody to be in the floppy disk business. So he put Tandon in the floppy disk business. And I actually met Tandon flying down with Steve Jobs, because Steve and I went to him and said, we need another supplier, right? So that's how Tandon became a floppy disk company, was because Shugart wasn't supplying enough, right? And Radio Shack was buying them. All right, we're going to make a jump when we go to MS-DOS, right? That's important, because we always don't want to get that story in. Okay, so now we have a floppy, we have a printer, we have the CBM, it's going like hell, but Apple's a real thorn in Jack's side, right? He just wasn't happy at all about Apple because they were outselling us in the United States. They actually turns out never outsold us in the United States, but their publicity made us believe they were outselling us in the United States. And we were outselling them worldwide, but Jack never spent much money on publicity, so we didn't really know it. And Regis McKenna was Apple, and we just McKenna lies, cheats, and steals, right? Jack said, I'll set you up in the lab. We actually had a lab. He says, I'll set you up in a lab. You got 6 to 9 months to come up with an Apple killer. You have to be able to do stuff with my MOS technology video and everything else that will be enough better and cheaper than Apple that we can put Apple out of business. And that was his goal, right? It was called the Apple killer. We took the team. We did some periphery stuff. We did the first touchscreen. We did we did about 3 things we did a networking thing, did a whole bunch of stuff in that lab that ultimately they wound up doing other ways, right? The first camera. We did the first CCD camera for a personal computer in that lab. And we came up with this architecture. We had some outside guys come in and look at it and everything else, and they came up with the idea of the kernel, which then Fagan's wound up implementing for that architecture. And we're working on a product that's good enough to knock off Apple, which meant we had to have screen capability somewhat equivalent to Apple's, right? And Charpentier and those guys didn't have it, but they sat down and we did the specs for them, and they were off doing it. And Seiler got fooling around in the lab and said, I can make a computer with this little screen.
Oop. I think
yeah.
He's very still, folks.
But it's a great shot. Well, I was just about to ask the chat room if anybody's in contact with Vegas, how they're holding up out there, and if we wanted to.
I'll pot them up while we try to get him back.
Yeah. See if there's some questions. And I'm thinking we've been on 3 hours now. If somebody said Chuck just had an NMI.
The person whom you're trying to reach is currently unavailable. Please leave a message.
NMIs are great. So what do you think so far, guys? Enjoying greatly, Larry J. But Larry J, you said you were going to auto-tune this. That reminds me of a story when I was a kid. I war-dialed the entire area code, and I didn't know how to turn the speaker off on my modem. So I was sitting in my room and I was hearing people go, hello, 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 as it dialed through the city. And I got into this bank of phone numbers that were used for the payphone system. And it had all these really fun messages like, please deposit 25 cents, you can't make an international call unless you do this or that. And those became useful to trick all my friends into thinking that I had ultimate control over the phone system. So I'd go over to their house. I would try, or I would tell them I was calling my father, and then I would dial one of these numbers that said you need to deposit 25 cents, and I hand it to them and I say, didn't you pay your phone bill? It's saying I need to deposit 25 cents.
So you were people hacking.
And I made all kinds of circuits that I could...
The person whom you're trying...
Yeah, we lost him suddenly too. So does Vegas have any questions, or is there any area that if we were to like say, hey, let's kind of think about a wrap up here, what would they like to hear about, or could we're up to the pet? I heard a lot of the stories that I like to hear. The Radio Shack and some of the Microsoft ones are always my favorite.
Robert? Okay, our first question. Can they hear me?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me this far away?
Yes.
Is that Robert?
Yes, this is me, Bill.
Hi, Robert. How are you?
Well, I'm okay. I'm good. The air conditioning is cold. The outside is like 107 outside.
I'm in very muggy New Jersey weather here, and I was thinking I would actually be cooler in Las Vegas.
We have a question here from Boris. He says, do you remember a John Colton with whom Jack seems to have founded the company with? What became of him after Jack left? What was this mysterious guy like?
What was the guy's name?
John Colton.
John Colton, Calton.
All right. Yeah, I haven't heard that name.
So
Okay.
he's a mysterious guy.
We'll go to the next question. This was a question for Chuck. Andrew Fisher is writing a new book about the history of the Commodore 64, and he wants Chuck to write the foreword for him. He wonders if Chuck would write the foreword for him.
Did you catch that, Jerry? I didn't.
Oh, is it not coming across? So Andrew Fisher is writing another book about Commodore, and he's wondering if Chuck will write a foreword for his new book. Let me try again to...
And on that same line of thought, Andrew says he's writing a book about Amiga. Would Dave Haney write a foreword for Andrew Fisher?
Well, I think either one, it would depend on how well portrayed in the book they are as to what kind of foreword they write.
Okay.
And Chuck's being nice today. It's interesting when he lets you know his honest opinion about some people down through history here.
Yeah, the Job of the Hutt Tramiel story didn't come up.
Okay, here's another question from, I don't have a name on this one either. Well, here's another question. It says, what advice do you have for future engineers who are on the breaking point of a booming technology in which they have some influence on its design and specifications?
I got the part up to the booming technology.
Right, it's a very long question. Well, what would you advice would you have for future engineers who are on the cutting edge of technology? I guess that's what it means.
Okay, I got it. So Chuck it looks like we're getting Chuck back.
Oh.
Am I back yet or not?
Yeah, seems like you must have had a big crash or something.
Yeah, I think was it me that crashed?
I think so.
Yeah, we've been here talking about you, so yeah, it was definitely. You're actually pretty whatever that word is, ephemeral now. You're just a voice.
That's funny.
Ephemeral. That's it.
You could hear me talk. You couldn't hear me talk because I powered.
No, we can only hear you talk in the last 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, Vegas, I'm gonna mute you because it's getting a lot of feedback. All right, so we were gonna shoot for wrapping this up, getting kind of towards the end of our allotted time.
I figured that. I'm sorry, I dragged it on too long.
No. I'd love to talk to you again at some point.
Yeah.
But we have a few questions.
Okay.
One question is, what advice do you have for young engineers that are maybe think they're on to the next big cutting edge thing?
Well, in today's market, it's totally different than it used to be because if you really have a story, right, there's plenty of venture capitalists that will back you, right? You basically, and you just, worst case, you got to get an angel to help you get started, right, and then go to the venture capitalists. It's when we started a lot of this stuff, there wasn't this flood of venture capital money around. So I would say, if you really think you're onto something, you have two choices. There's another choice, which is what I wound up doing with every deal I ever did, and that's find a company that could use it, and then go to work with that company and cut them a deal to do it. And that hasn't worked very well for me. I've gotten cheated and taken advantage of, but venture capitalists take advantage of you too. I think the answer is your expectation should be that you believe in something enough that you're willing to kill for it, that you're willing to work, as Bill says, day and night for a long period of time, and that you're liable to get cheated out of the reward and cheated out of the money, but you'll have done it, right? And that sounds like funny statements, but if you're willing to accept all of those things, go for it, right? But do it with enough money, right? I mean, nowadays, bootstrapping it, you can get somebody like Jeri. Maybe Jeri, you can help people and stuff like that get something built. But it's, if you want to get anything serious, the problem is right now that anything serious takes a whole bunch of marketing dollars, right? And it takes a whole bunch of manufacturing tie-ins to Asia and all that. And so what you want to do is get it to the point that you can talk to people about it and then go raise some money.
Yeah, cool. You described comma there for a second, with the dedication it took, the time.
Well, yeah, no, there's no question, right? If you think you're going to have a great breakthrough idea and you're going to make it happen with an 8-to-5 job and a pretty young lady like Jeri to come home to, forget it, right? Almost all the people I know that have done it and have lost wives, right? Everything else along the way, right? I mean, it's got to become
an obsession,
part of your soul. Yeah, it's got to be. If your soul isn't in it, you're not going to make it happen, right? By the way, it may be a good idea. Why don't you give it to somebody who can put their soul into it?
Yeah.
Give it to Jeri.
I'll run with it.
Yeah.
And she's had experience being ripped off, so in phase 2, she'll be even better.
Life lessons.
Yeah. No, but I may have sound negative, but I just wanted to make it clear because a few people like Gates, who did a lot of bad turns but still made it happen, stayed rich because he kept control of his company, right? But most of the pioneers in this business didn't get as wealthy as they might have, right? And certainly didn't get the credit that was due. I mean, Jobs got a lot of credit because he had Regis McKenna, and he had Mike Markkula, who made it happen, right? By the way, that's a lesson for you. Apple would have been junk, wouldn't have been anything. They would never have happened. Jobs and Markkula and Woz convinced a guy by the name of Mike Markkula, who was ex-marketing guy for Intel, that this was a good idea. And Mike brought in Mike Scott, who was a really good operations guy, and they brought in a good engineering guy. And Markkula is the one that made that company happen, right? Not Steve and not Steve, right? So find yourself somebody that you can sell your idea to, right? Who's in between places, and there's a whole bunch of those guys around there who have a reputation, right? They can help you make it happen a lot, right? And by the way, their experience will be very valuable for you, right? Mark Andreessen did it with who was the guy he did it with? Famous guy that did one of the computer companies when they did the browser. It was Andreessen and another guy who was very famous. What?
Yeah, you hit Andreessen. That's who I thought you were going for.
No, not Andreessen. Who was Andreessen with? Who was the guy he was with? The Andreessen was the young superstar, right? But there was a senior guy who had done a computer company before, who was the guy that brought Andreessen along and made it possible, right? And I think that's happened in several cases where some really bright idea, really bright star ties in with one of these guys who is accomplished and not ready to retire, right? And the combination of the two, because those guys know how to raise money, and because of their reputation, they have a much easier time raising money. But more importantly, they have a lot of business sense, right?
Yeah.
It takes some mileage to learn.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or at least leaves scar tissue. Yeah.
So that's important. Jeri, do I have 2 minutes to wrap up the Kim one?
Oh, absolutely.
Not the Kim one, but the Vic 20.
Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Seiler actually dreamed of the idea himself, right? He talked to the guys that were making the chip, and he talked Fagans into giving him a modified version of the work he was doing for the Apple Killer. And Seiler built one, and we took it to the show. We took it to a back room at Comdex, at CES. We did a back room where we showed the first hard disk for PC and a whole bunch of other stuff. And Trammell looked at it, and he got pissed at me. He said, "You're trying to cheat me because that can't compete with Apple. Okay? You don't have the Apple Killer ready," and I didn't because MS technology wasn't ready. And he said, "You failed, right?" And he gave me all kinds of crap. Then Jack flew to England about 3 or 4 months later, saw that Clyde Sinclair was tearing up the market with the I can't remember what the hell it was called. The computer that was so bad that by the time you figured out that you shouldn't have bought it, you'd learned what you could learn
Too late.
from it.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Anyhow, the Sinclair, whatever it was, right? And the guys, Seiler, because he thought it really should happen to be a product, he went to the guys at MS Technology and says, "We're not going to pull this off. Jack's already mad at us. You guys see if you can convince Jack to do it." So they convinced Jack that it was something that they knew how to do, right? Well, it turns out they didn't. Seiler and Stark and Scotty Patterson, and those are the two names I want to make sure get said. Scotty Patterson and Glenn Stark did everything on floppies for Commodore, did the interface, the serial interface for the Kim one, and they made Commodore real seriously money because the serial interface, which we put in over a weekend, plus the Kim, the version of the machine we built over the weekend, was what then they took out and went to a show with and got all of the thing that made the VIC-20 happen. And of course there's a bunch of stories written about that. We got thrown out of Commodore within 2 months after that, right? So we didn't carry on, but all of the work on the C64 was really put in place, and guys at MS Technology really just finished it up. But Yaz Turakur, who was working with us on it before, is the guy that drove that, in my opinion, and Al Charpentier, who was doing the chip, right? Do you think Winterball deserves credit in there, Bill?
I remember hearing his name in there a lot, and of course Bob Yanis for the SID chip.
Yanis actually was the guy that sold Jack, right? Yanis personally sold Jack, right?
That goes with what I've heard.
Yeah, and but the work that was really made it happen was really work that was already done by Fagans in the computer lab, right? And Seiler and all those guys, and so we all take pride in the C64. But anyhow, that's the end of the Commodore story. The Commodore went on to become very rich and very famous, and then Jack Trammell overstocked and did a bunch of bad things and got fired, and then the company just died. But he threw out all the good people, right? We would have built the MS-DOS company we built for Trammell if he'd have let us, right? He just didn't want to go there anymore. So, end of that story. I'm sorry, I just wanted to get most of the... Who did we leave out?
I'm sad now. I mean, that's the Commodore story always ends on a sad note, it seems like, and it just did again, but that's reality.
Well, no, we were the first company to sell 1 million computers a month.
Yeah?
Right? I mean, come on. We changed... No. One last thing. I'm sorry. I want to make sure...
No, this is great stuff. Go on.
I want to make sure we agree that the C64... Let me take a minute and talk about the C64.
Best computer ever in the world. Ever.
No, well, I don't know if it's the best computer, but let me just tell you something.
Highest selling.
We did the C64 because we were working on the Apple Killer. We knew we wanted a computer that would sell for $100. Okay? And we had all the technology to do that. We built all the technology to do that. And we knew that we could build that product for $100 and sell it for $100, and that at $100 everybody was going to buy one, right? For their kids, for games, because by that time games were starting to come on stream. And of course the VIC-20 really pulled the game business up, right? I mean, so the Commodore 64 had a plan, right, to be the ultimate consumer computer, right, and to create in all of the kids in the world a understanding, because this is my underlying plan, was I wanted them to all learn BASIC. I wanted them to all learn about computers. I wanted them to know that computers were part of their lives forever. And the C64 did that. It killed Atari, it killed TI because they tried to compete with it on price.
Yeah.
It killed MSX, right?
Yeah.
It sold 1 million a month. But more importantly, every kid learned that he wanted a computer and went on to buy computers in multiple quantities, right?
Yep.
Because of that, right? And got turned on to computer careers and everything else. I'm just really proud of the way that happened, and a whole lot of people made it happen, and they did it because they were supposed to. But we were changing the world. We changed the world when we did the PET. We changed the world when we did the C64. Okay, and Bill Seiler changed the world when he did the VIC-20. Okay. Yep. So, end of discussion. Commodore was the leading company that led to all the successes in the computer business today. It's a shame, absolute shame, that Jack Tramiel didn't let us carry that company on.
Yep.
Okay.
And Dave Haney did a video called Deathbed Vigil that really shows the decline of the company then, and I haven't watched it. I can't watch it. It's too sad. Of how without the head the dinosaur lumbered on and basically stepped on its own intestines.
Yeah. Anyhow, the point was is that, well, Jack had thrown all the good guys out. Tom Mitchell went off to do Seagate. The chief financial officer went off and built the biggest distributor on the West Coast, right? I mean, there was some really tremendously talented people there, and we were on the right path. We knew what we needed. We were the most successful business computer in Europe, right? We had the future in our hands, and Jack made a decision. I remember him making a decision. I'm only going to do consumer computers. I don't want to do business computers, right? And he threw us out because we made him an offer. It said we'll set up a separate company within your company to do the business computer, so we don't interfere with you doing the personal computer, because we knew we could already do it. Was already done, right? The work was mostly dependent on Charpentier and those guys, right? And it would happen.
I hadn't heard that before. I hadn't heard that you had made an offer like that.
Yeah, myself and Dick Sanford, Chris Fish, and he threw us all out within a month, right? He was really angry at us for even suggesting it.
Well, I remember our games group made an offer that they wanted royalties, and they got thrown out. I mean, that seemed to be kind of a pattern there.
Yeah, I mean, they... and
he didn't want to share.
Well, no, I don't think it was even want to share.
Well, responsibility or, yeah.
Territory. No, I think, by the way, in another totally different interview, if she wants to do it, we'll talk about why guys that start things like this get stepped on. There's a reason, right? Fundamental reason. And
I'd like to do that.
I got 2 in my history, right? And I've got 2 more that I can talk about, right, that are really key things that show that the guys who really make it happen are so dangerous within the companies that they get thrown out. You know, you must have seen it, Bill, right? The guys who are really the fire plugs don't last.
And we had a problem then where the sheep were starting to accumulate, and without wolves to thin them out, I talk a lot about the real heavy middle management and what they were doing, because they weren't being thrown out at the rate that some of the good people did at jack attacks, we called them.
Well, yeah, but see, that's the point. That what happens is the company gets a little bit successful and it becomes hidebound, right? I mean, it gets all the intermediate layers and everything like that. Yeah. Anyhow, Jerry, we've wasted your time. Thank you. This
has been a pleasure. We have a couple of quick questions. Just want to get those out. These are coming from Vegas. The Commodore Group is watching.
By the way, thank the Commodore Group for hosting us too. I love the fact they picked the company up and resurrected it. Right?
Still, lots of people using the machines as a hobby.
And still celebrating it all these years later.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, so those guys did a good job just resurrecting it, right? Because it had a stake in its heart.
Yeah.
So a couple quick questions. They were wondering. Boris asks, there's a mysterious person called John Colton that worked at Moss.
John Carlton.
Carlton. Okay.
Yeah. John was a poor Irish guy that Jack used as his kick-around guy. and he would do anything Jack asked him, and he would tick Jack off about once a year, and so Jack would kick him out of the United States for a year, and he had to go around Asia and front for the company. But John did some good things, and he made some good money, and he would never have done anything else with his life other than with Commodore. And he's a really pleasant guy, but he was known but not instrumental.
Okay, and last question from Vegas. Andrew Fisher, who's written a book about Commodore, is writing another book about Commodore, and he's wondering if you would write a foreword for his new book.
Sure, I'm happy to do anything. Anybody that tells the truth, which is the story we were trying to get across. I'm going to do a little summary just to make sure we understand. There's no question, provable. I'm going to send some pictures to Jeri and so forth. We were announced as this birth of the computer, right? Our basic machine, what we were trying to do was what people bought, right? Everybody else had to copy us. So there's no question that Apple didn't lead this market. Radio Shack didn't lead this market. Commodore led this market. And the 6502 drove the low-cost computer, even though ultimately people like Intel and everything else copied them. So both of those deserve a place in history that they don't really have, except among the cognoscenti. Okay? And by the way, Bill, I don't think we ever get credit for the fact we sold more computers in a month than people sold in years, right?
And isn't it still true today that the highest single model of any computer sold was the Commodore 64? All the PCs and everything they're sold, not the same single model like we did.
Well, yeah, if we had time, we'd have done the story about the PC and the Vic and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Remember, the original PC was a failure.
Yeah.
It was the redo with the XP. Most people don't realize there were two PCs, right? There was the original PC and then the one that they built around the hard drive. That's another whole history.
Will you come back and
I'd love
do
to
another 2 or 3 hours with us?
No, I'd be willing to come back and particularly talk about the impact of discs and what that all meant, because that was I was trying to do something. Remember, I was trying to do something with the PET. I had a model. My model was that people had to have a hard drive built into this thing we were doing, right? And I was doing everything I could to make it happen, and we ultimately did, right? And of course, the thing nowadays is that the hard drive, none of you, maybe Bill, did you do it? Did you ever use a machine with just floppies?
Oh.
The Amiga came out with just floppies.
No, yeah, but did you ever use a machine with just floppy? You're pretty old, young.
Oh, like Commodore 64 is what I started with, and moved on to the Amiga, and only had one floppy drive.
But in both those cases, they were slightly different computers. Do you ever try to use a PC type thing with just floppies?
No, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you the story, and then if you want to do the whole story, we can do it, because it's an important story. When we introduced, Jackie Tandon and I sat down and said, we're going to make the world copy us and do hard drives, right? Built into machines, because both and I believe we should have it. And so we put together a price point that nobody believed, right? And announced it at the CS show in the fall. Not the CS, the Comdex in the fall. And we were 6 months ahead of IBM. IBM had to come out with an equivalent product. We knew the guys that designed it. They actually worked for us at Tandon for a while, and they agreed that we effectively forced them into doing that machine, right? And when I introduced it at the show, everybody said, "You guys already got 2 megabytes of floppy. Why do we need a hard drive?" And I'd built 20 of them, and I told them, "Go sit down for 15 minutes, use that machine, and come back and ask me the question again." Then I remember came back, right? It changed the way computers worked, right? It was an important step. And now USBs are happening, and I'm working on SATA, and so we're still doing it.
Right. And it seems like common sense today, but back then it was new.
No, not just new. It was totally. People didn't know it, right? It's okay. That's what people who have a vision are supposed to do, right? You're supposed to find a way. My friend, not my friend, but Stevens, I knew Steven Spielberg, right? He believed in certain things, right? And he made them happen. And certainly Lucas, right, has made it happen. People kind of have to pull these other people along, right? And they do it by doing things, and then all of a sudden, 10 years later, everybody says, well, we never thought about doing it any other way. Well, the answer is bullshit. It wasn't being done the other way. It's just that it was wrong, right? And by the way, we had to go through the floppy step. The hard drives didn't work, right? I mean, the floppy step was an important step.
Yeah.
But as you noticed, once we really got good hard drives and we got the ability to take hard drives in and out and stuff like that, who uses disks anymore? As a matter of fact, my laptop doesn't have a disk on it. There's almost no laptops have disks, right?
No, it's pretty much over now.
Yep.
Well, we should turn on Vegas. If you want to turn your video on, let's let Chuck see what's going on over there and let them wave. Okay, I'll switch over to those guys and let you. I gotta switch them to full screen. All right, just 1 second, guys. All right, everyone.
Hey guys, thank you for listening, right?
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
It's somewhere in there. It's Dave Haney, I believe.
Yep.
There
There's Haney. He's from my generation.
Dave, get over that. We want.
Yep.
Just put your face right in front of the camera.
Dave was there till the very bloody end.
Yes, Dave.
Yeah. So, there's no question that I really appreciate. I think I said it but
Hi, Robert.
the fact that Commodore has been resurrected and that name still lives is only due to you guys.
Thank you.
Very cool. Hey, Chuck, I really appreciate your time, and it's just an absolute honor to speak with you here today.
Yeah, well, I probably drag it on too long. I'm sorry.
No, this stuff's great. I'd love to have you back on again sometime. Get all the stories, get them out there.
Well, we should do MS-DOS because that was the way that was the turning point, right? The Commodore was really like the end of the era, right? And then MS-DOS to Windows and all that stuff was another. It's really almost like another evolution, right? And there were some key factors and key players that deserve some credit there that never got any credit.